Hi there. I wanted to give an introduction to a series of video teachings that I'll be giving over the coming months, perhaps a year or more, explaining a body of teachings that it is at the root of Buddhist teachings known as the Pali Canon. Um, the Pali Canon is the largest collection of early Buddhist teachings, meaning teachings that reliably date back to the original teachings of Buddha 2,600 years ago, his contemporaries, and perhaps the some additions over the following few centuries. These early teachings in the Pali Canon, they form the basis of what is known as Theravadan Buddhism. Theravadan means way of the elders. Often in the Mahayana and Vajrayana world, it's referred to as Hinayana Buddhism. So when I make these references, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, these refer to a system known as the three vehicles that is used in what is also known as Northern Buddhism. So sometimes we divide Buddhism into Southern Buddhism, that which spread to Sri Lanka and then as well to Thailand and Burma and so forth, which is traditionally this Theravadan Buddhist school. And then Northern Buddhism, which spread to Nepal, Tibet, China, Japan, Korea, which became what is known as the Mahayana school. And within the Mahayana, there is a subset, most famously Tibetan Buddhism, although not exclusive to Tibetan Buddhism, called Vajrayana. So these three terms, you may have encountered these. There's three basic divisions of Buddhism. And as you can see, there's different names that are used for these different schools. But in any case, all of these schools have a sacred body of teachings that are attributed to Buddha's original teachings. Now, the Buddhist body of literature is very, very vast compared to, for example, the Bible. So the Bible, of course, anyone who's familiar with biblical scholarship knows that there have been many, many variations composed, the chapters of the Bible composed by many, many authors over a very long period of time. But there's a certain core set of teachings that are attributed to Jesus, for example. But that's just a small number of books, right? Just the gospel is 4 books that are attributed directly to Jesus. The remaining ones are preceding him or commentaries by later teachers like Paul and so forth. Not that I'm an expert in biblical scholarship. Buddha taught for 45 years, and he traveled as opposed to Jesus, who taught for just a few years and gave just a few key sermons like Sermon on the Mount and so forth. Buddha taught for 45 years, right? But he also built a massive community, thousands of monks following him, right? Famously, and many of these monks as well giving their own teachings that are also recorded in the sutras and so forth. But the essence of these teachings is very subtle and very profound. And the Buddhist scriptural tradition has been a living tradition in that some later sutras are attributed to Buddha, said to be the words of Buddha, but openly sort of recognized as more deriving from the inspiration of Buddha as opposed to his historical words. So that's what I mean when I say the teachings of the Pali Canon are the largest collection of early Buddhist teachings. They exclude some of these Mahayana and Vajrayana sutras. There are 5 main books in the Pali Canon, and they include a lot of repetitive sutras. And so the full set that include all of the repetition without condensing anything will fill like a bookcase. And that's not including the Mahayana and the Vajrayana texts or the later commentaries, which then becomes multiple bookcases. So it's a very vast body of material, which is very intimidating for modern people, I think also for ancient people, very intimidating to try to dig into that. Now, there are 5 main books. There's a condensation of the Pali Canon that removes a lot of the repetitive bits, and just gives a nice, fairly concise version. And that's in 5 books. Now, this is one of them. This is called the Connected Discourses, or the Samyutta Nikaya. So you'll see this abbreviation SN, Samyutta Nikaya, in a lot of places, by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Bhikkhu means monk, monk whose name was Bodhi. But he's a modern American British monk who took the time to translate this and compile this from the original Pali. Now, as you can see, this is a thick book. This is the condensed version of the Samyutta Nikaya. Now, it includes every single one of the sutras in the Samyutta Nikaya, but some of them are just heavily abbreviated. And so you see, these sections where, some of these sutras are mentioned here, 312 and so forth, and just says these are the same as some of these other sutras. So that's what I mean when I say this is condensed. So you can buy this book. Traditionally, Buddhist teachings are given for free. Some communities where it's possible, they give away physical copies of these books away for free. YouTube here, this is for free. But you can also buy this on Amazon. And there's a lot of people who need to get paid along the way, and a lot of Bhikkhu Bodhi, of course, not receiving money from this himself, but anyway, you can buy this book. So this video is the introduction to a project that I'm going to start to try to present an oral transmission in English of the main sutras from this Samyutta Nikaya, and then maybe other sutras. This is an ambitious project. So while I can say my intention is to go through the entire Samyutta Nikaya and give oral transmission on all of these teachings, whether I succeed in completing that project or not may depend on many factors, but wish me luck. So the reason for doing this, I'll explain the reason for doing this in a few minutes, but I've had the opportunity over the last 6 or 9 months to study under a Korean teacher professor named Lee Jung-pyo, or Jung-pyo Lee, the American way around, who I'll refer to as Professor Lee. So Professor Lee is one of the main Buddhist scholars in Korea, probably in the top 5 or 10 Buddhist scholars in Korea. And his scholarship has led him to some significant and profound and somewhat controversial conclusions about the meaning of these teachings and how to convey these teachings for the modern world. And so I've had the opportunity to receive his teachings. My wife has translated them from Korean into English. We listen to them together, study and discuss them every day, basically. And my wish is to pass along his commentary, the essence of his explanation. And so that's why that's why I'm doing this. And in particular, his explanation, I believe, is unique, or almost unique, among teachers that I've found, in that it blends a fidelity or a faithfulness to the original words of these teachings with the kind of scholarship that you would expect from modern people who acknowledge that these teachings may have been altered or evolved over time, that there are historical and cultural and anthropological contexts and backgrounds behind all of these sutras that are useful to explain some of the meaning, and in particular for modern people, is not based in a supernatural explanation of these teachings, or a superstitious explanation of these teachings, shall we say. We are, it seems, I don't think it's very controversial to say that we are in a very interesting time for human society, and we're at the crossroads of all kinds of factors, not least of which is, increasing number of causes potentially leading to human extinction. We are also at the crossroads between traditional views, including religious views, um, and a traditional, simpler way of life that includes, woven into the fabric of religious teachings, ethical teachings, teachings on social and communal harmony, teachings on finding inner peace, teachings on finding meaning in our lives, teachings on finding wisdom, on controlling our own impulses, on controlling our own addictions and harmful tendencies, and so forth, and being the best, strongest, most powerful person we can be. So religious teachings traditionally have been the vessel through which such guidance has been carried and passed down from generation to generation. Religions carry with them essential, critically important teachings that are valuable for each of us personally to orient to the world and orient to our personal world, the struggles we face when we have this challenge. How should we respond? And when we are tempted in this way, how should we respond? And so forth. And the reason religions have been carried down to the present day is because of the rich human benefit and value that they convey to us. Now, traditionally, say a few hundred years ago, religious teachings were the only, or almost the only, formal body of knowledge that was passed down systematically, um, you know, to the general public, and the literate communities were often or almost exclusively the religious communities. And so religious teachers, traditionally, they would be teachers of ethics and these advice for human living, but they would also be teachers on cosmology. They would explain how the cosmology of the universe. They'd be teachers on history, right? They'd explain where the world came from and what the important events in history. They'd be teachers on science and biology, explaining the variety of living creatures and all these kinds of things. And so as human knowledge has been developing, especially over the last few centuries, especially starting in Europe, we have begun to develop more scientific knowledge, more secular focus on history and biology and these kinds of things. And the conclusions and the understanding and the observations of the world reached by these scientific thinkers and so forth, historians and so forth, differ dramatically from the teachings given in religious contexts. And so more and more and more of our understanding of reality is coming from these secular sources, which are, from biologists and physicists and historians and so forth. And the body of knowledge accumulated in these fields is extraordinary, right? And the level of rigor and intellectual honesty and so forth, although maybe not perfect in general, is extraordinarily high compared to, and the richness and detail with which we can explain the world through these teachings is unimaginably rich compared to the traditional teachings received in religious contexts. And so the role of religion has been shrinking in our society. The religion as a source of guidance, conscious guidance for our minds and as individuals and for our culture. The role of religion has been shrinking. As we have needed to know things beyond just how to farm, for example, or how to forage for food and so forth, as we've needed to know things like how to build, how to, laws of physics become important if you're building things, right? How to create machines, right? How to interpret different cultures and our interactions and so forth. But nevertheless, there's been voices saying, these religious teachings are very, very precious, and we want to hold on to them. It's very conservative or reactionary forces saying, listen, we have to just focus on these religious teachings. We're going to ignore these other things, right? And I'm growing up in America. I'm particularly familiar with this in the Christian tradition, where Christians, there's been a big movement towards biblical literalism over much of the last century, fighting back against things like the law of evolution and the theory of evolution and all kinds of other bits of modern knowledge, because Christians found it to be impossible to reconcile teachings in the Bible with scientific teachings, has created this culture war. Now, this is really, really, really old news, right? This has been going on for centuries. But the same thing can arise in Buddhist traditions, right? As people are trying to understand Buddhist traditions, they think, well, I'll just, study the Buddhist teachings and I'll kind of ignore other more modern scientific views. And that reflects this gradual movement of society from a pre-literate society into a literate society, where around the world, if you grew up in India in the 50s, odds are you grew up in a very small village, small farm, where the Hindu priests were the main voice of influence in that community. But of course, if you grew up in India now in the 2020s, 2010s, 2000s, 1990s, and so forth, you're likely to live in a city, in or near a city. You're likely to have access to the internet and so forth. You're likely to be literate. And so societies around the world have been transitioning from pre-literate into literate societies, and from literate societies into societies that are internet connected with access to infinite information, basically. And that's really causing a massive shock around the world to these traditional religious values as well. The availability of things like pornography dramatically shaping people's relationship to traditional ideas around sexuality and morality and behavior and these kinds of things. Access to new drugs, right? The TV and movies with tons of violence and so forth. All these things have caused cultural pressure and challenges to as well. I should mention also the elevation of personalities who may be famous, maybe seem admirable or beautiful and so forth, but don't necessarily embody religious values, for example, ethical values. So creates a lot of pressures on our minds about who should we follow, who should we be influenced by, who's right. Our parents say we should do this, but clearly our parents don't know anything about science, right? Or they don't know anything about history and so forth. So why should I trust their view? Instead, I should trust these more modern views. So the growth of human knowledge now is incredible, right? Highly our knowledge, the growth of knowledge, what it means for knowledge to be growing and changing and readjusting and reconfiguring itself. That's what we call, or at least what I call, progressive knowledge. That's a progressive view, that we're making progress in understanding the world. It is very hard to argue that we're not making progress in terms of ability to understand the world, control the world, make machines, share information, and all these kinds of things. Society is making phenomenal progress. But traditional religious teachings are not progressive. They are conservative, highly conservative. These religious communities also have very strict codes of ethic, more or less strict codes of ethics, very clear ideas about what are the beliefs, what are not the beliefs, and so forth. And so these religious teachings, they have a certain integrity to them, a set of beliefs. They're a system of knowledge, shall we say, that have an internal integrity to them. They are relatively self-consistent, relatively free from contradictions, but is one coherent body of knowledge and set of recommendations about behavior. We can think about these three main aspects: what is valuable, what is your understanding of the world, and what you should do. These three, and we'll come back to these a lot, right? What is valuable, what's your understanding of the world, and what you should do. These three aspects are the main characteristics of culture. So religions are cultures, and these cultures, the religious cultures, have preserved themselves generation after generation after generation, right? But they've conserved themselves by having a very conservative view of the world. Like, this is correct, this is not correct. This is our belief, that's other belief, right? Now, there is a fundamental contradiction between conservative bodies of knowledge, like religious and ethical beliefs, and progressive bodies of knowledge that reassess things like what is appropriate sexual behavior, what should be our view of how the world was produced, right? How should we interact with others? Um, how should we regard strangers, people who are very different from us? All of these, there's a challenge, right? We as individuals may be squeezed between having grown up with some traditional teachings and then wanting to know more about the world around us, and we may make adjustments uh, to try to, reject progressive secular teachings and just hold on to religious teachings. A lot of people, a lot of conservative, even modern people, moving into these, like having a very conservative view, conservative way of thinking about the world, to try to protect and to preserve these religious teachings, which, as I said at the beginning, do have enormous benefits to help us orient to the world. But much of the world says, listen, clearly some of these teachings are objectively wrong. You observe the world and they do not match these traditional religious teachings. So why would I hold to these? I'm going to follow these progressive views. And you reject religion and follow these more progressive secular views. And some people, we try to have a foot in both worlds and try to take the best of both worlds, I suppose. And most people probably are more in that middle camp. But as we can see, there's a tension, right? And as we get more into this secular, progressive world of technology, right, the incredible pace at which information is moving, the pace at which we can interact with each other, encounter people from other views, and so forth, is very, very, very disorienting and destabilizing. And so the incidence of mental illness in society at large, in America at least, is on the rise, especially among young people, high school students, and so forth, reporting, I think, as much as 40% of them reporting suicidal thoughts sometimes, or feelings of intense depression. A lot of problems with anxiety and depression in particular. And with that, a lot of the rise of the use of psychiatric drugs, which certainly can, bring benefit to people, but they're also being pushed forward and peddled by pharmaceutical companies who have a financial interest in people becoming dependent on these psychiatric drugs, as opposed to finding other means to stabilize our patterns of thinking. Anyway, we're also on the verge of destroying ourselves. The number of existential threats that we're facing, nuclear war is now the old one, but it is very, very, very present. The US and Russia now on the flirting with a hot war, moving from a cold war to a hot war. North Korea, China, situation around Taiwan, and so forth. India, Pakistan, perpetual threats of nuclear war. Moved, I was taught about global warming 40 years ago. The oil companies' invested interests fought to try to prevent it from becoming widely acknowledged. But we're way beyond the shadow of a doubt about the threat of global warming now, realizing that it is a phenomenal existential threat. So we talk about a 2 degrees Celsius rise as being devastating. You need to understand the Earth's ecosystem in the same way you look at your body temperature. Your body is perfectly tuned to operate at around 98.6, 98.9 degrees Fahrenheit. If it rises 1.5 degrees, if it rises 2 degrees, it doesn't kill you right away, right? But it causes all kinds of stuff to shut down. And so that's what we should think about when we think about, that analogy is probably the most useful one when we think about catastrophic climate change effects. Artificial intelligence, right now there's a frenzy of commercial interest around artificial intelligence. But artificial intelligence easily becoming uncontrolled. Autonomous killing machines are being developed by most major military powers around the world. Cyber security threats, we're undermining and infiltrating each other's infrastructure around the world. Culture clashes, America being on the edge of a cold civil war, or even maybe a hot civil war. Anyway, the list goes on of legitimate existential threats. Now, with all of these existential threats, there is all of these crises are. I really appreciate the point of view of people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Tristan Harris and so forth, framing these as a meta crisis. A meta crisis, the meta crisis being the crisis in our ability to make sense of the world, our crisis in our ability to think clearly, discuss with one another, peacefully look for solutions, control our behaviors where we notice that they're causing harms and so forth. If our ability individually and collectively to choose our course of behavior, if our ability individually and collectively to make sense of the world, if our ability to discuss with one another is compromised, it opens us up to the risk of all of these other existential threats become difficult or impossible to solve, right? So all of these various crises, at the core of all of them is a human sense-making crisis, a crisis of each of us as individuals to orient ourselves to the world, to remain peaceful, strong, composed, and to be able to engage in constructive dialogue with others, moving towards beneficial solutions. If we can solve collectively as humans, if we can solve this meta crisis of our inability to make sense of the world, inability to communicate effectively with others, inability to collaborate and share our knowledge and find solutions together, if we can overcome that, we can solve all the other problems. As many people have said, the solutions to climate change are well known, they're well understood. What is lacking is collective will to execute on them. The primary solution being to move from a mindset of uncontrolled exponential growth, an attachment to growth, to a mind that recognizes we need to achieve a steady state of human presence in this world and human economic activity, as opposed to always seeking, craving growth. This is called a post-growth mindset. Similarly, there are well-known, well-established solutions to nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, the risks from that, and so forth, if we can collectively make sense of the world, find peace. So my intention in presenting these teachings is to present these ancient, early teachings of Buddhism in a way that is secular and modern and acknowledges their historical and anthropological context, but gets to the root of the profound psychological and philosophical shift that is being advised and taught in these teachings. There is a liberating wisdom. There is a liberating wisdom that Buddha taught. Buddha has a good reputation, even whether you're Buddhist, non-Buddhist, he has a good reputation. Why does he have a good reputation? He's a person who has brought his mind under control. He's a person who has controlled his behavior, controlled his thought, controlled his speech. And through controlling himself and finding perfect peace, he's modeled how people can live in harmony with one another. He's modeled how people can live in harmony with themselves, and how we can recognize and acknowledge both the virtuous tendencies in the mind as well as the non-virtuous, like destructive tendencies in the mind. We can acknowledge these without a feeling of overwhelm, and we can simply choose to act on the virtuous tendencies and not act on the non-virtuous, destructive, harmful tendencies without this massive sense of conflict, right? So the purpose of Buddhist teachings is to bring about peace of mind, harmony, meaning both being in harmony with one another, as well being in harmony with reality, being in harmony with the world, being in harmony with nature. We can say a purity of behaviors, a peace, harmony, and a purity of behavior. Pure meaning that a person their actions are not polluted by negative behavior, harmful behavior. So the characteristic of purity means that we're acting in an ethical way, that we are people that can be relied upon to not harm others. This is what we mean by purity. Anyway, so I will be giving a direct transmission of many, hopefully all, of these teachings in the Samyutta Nikaya, but I'll be doing it from a modern point of view, as I mentioned, going systematically one sutra at a time, but explaining them in a way that we can, as modern people, appreciate based on our current understanding of how the world works. I've explained my motivation for doing this. I've explained what I'm going to do. I will mention briefly my background. I have obviously 40, in my mid 40s now, 46, born in the US. I've been Buddhist for about 30 years, since I was 16. I guess my 30th anniversary of that just passed. And but formally studying for about 25 of those 30 years. And 15 of those years was as a Buddhist monk. I was a monk in what is known as the New Kadampa Tradition, which is a Vajrayana Buddhist tradition. My teacher was a Tibetan teacher, Geshe Kelsang Gyatso. And the New Kadampa Tradition is extraordinary, beautiful community. In terms of the teachings, the community, the way they've organized and so forth. They've definitely been controversial for multiple reasons, in terms of being primarily because of publicly demonstrating against the Dalai Lama and breaking with Tibetan hierarchy and so forth. But so I'm no longer actively involved with that community, but it is still the main set of teachings that have guided my understanding. And the reason I mention that is because those teachings really brought together a perfect synthesis of these, of the early Buddhist teachings and the later Buddhist teachings, what's known as the Hinayana, the Mahayana, the Vajrayana. The way the teachings were explained showed how all three of these bodies of practice in the Buddhist tradition were perfectly harmonious and could be understood in a perfectly harmonious way. And then through the kindness of my teacher and teachers, these teachings were translated into English. And had I not encountered these teachings in English in Baltimore, my hometown, I would not have this benefit. So I am enormously indebted to those teachers, all of my teachers, who have shared this wisdom with me and given me access in this way. And I'm grateful to have a chance to pass these along to you. More recently, I've been studying with my wife with a number of Theravadan teachers, originally in the Thai forest tradition, teachers like Ajahn Sushito, Ajahn Sona, Ajahn Amaro. These are teachers from the Thai forest tradition that originated with Ajahn Chah, a Thai monk, and came to England primarily and also to the US. And then more recently with this Professor Lee Zhongpyo, or Zhongpyo Lee, who has done the first translation of all of the Pali Canon into modern Korean language, right? So we can credit, so I have to credit Professor Lee with introducing me to the Pali Canon in this way. His motivation for translating the Pali Canon, because his training was as a Mahayana monk, his view was that most of Korean Buddhism has lost its way. There's a lot of confusion in Korean Buddhism, a lot of just empty ritual and meaningless recitation and superstition. And he said, if you've discovered that you've lost your way and you're not sure where to go, the only reliable course of action you can take is to retrace your steps back to where you started. And once you retrace your steps back to where you started, you can be reoriented, and then you may set off on a slightly different course. And so for that reason, he went from the traditional teachings emphasized in the Korean tradition, the Mahayana teachings, and traced back to the original teachings, the Pali Canon, the root of Buddha's teachings. And these teachings like any root, they feed and nourish the body of all Buddhist teachings. Now, we should understand these teachings not like Buddhism's not like a, well, it is like a tree in the sense that the core of a tree is dead, it's already passed, but the skin of the tree is living, right? And the surface area of the tree is living. So the ancient Buddhist teachers have passed away, their cultures no longer exist and so forth, but on their basis, on that foundation, teachings have continued into the present day. Now, the branches that are represented by Burmese Buddhism and, Sri Lankan Buddhism and Zen Japanese Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism as it's come to the United States in various waves, they're very distant from each other on this tree, but they're still part of the same tree. They're still emerging from the same root. And we need to understand this root deeply. And studying the Pali Canon has been one of the most informative and educational experience I've had, which is why I want to pass these teachings along to you. I've also had the opportunity to receive a classical education in modern science and so forth, primarily the hard sciences, not so much in sociology, anthropology, and history and so forth, although I've worked to try to remedy some of those gaps. And I continue to this day as an IT professional to be studying various concepts that are prevalent in the world of IT, including and especially a lot of the thinkers in the 20th century who have been part of the cybernetics movement and part of the systems thinking movement. Modern teachers like Fritjof Capra, older teachers like Stafford Beer and Norbert Wiener and Gregory Bateson and so forth. So I'll try to make reference to some of these modern thinkers, just not so much to name drop and to try to impress any listeners, if there are any listeners, but for the purpose of helping to clarify how there is a new view emerging of the world that reconciles these two seemingly incompatible aspects of religion and spirituality, that reconcile the aspects of ethics and communal harmony and peace with teachings on understanding the outer world and scholastic rigor. So anyway, this is my intention. Very, very grateful for the opportunity and look forward to conveying these teachings. Thank you.